The final metallic click of the apartment door locking behind her echoed in the grimy hallway, a sound that severed the last thread connecting Helen to her old life. A tremor ran through her body, not just from the chill of the evening air that snaked its way through her thin cardigan, but from the sheer paralyzing terror that had taken root in her soul. At 38, she was a widow, a seamstress with no work, and now, officially homeless. Her fingers, numb and clumsy, tightened around the crisp, cruel paper of the eviction notice. The ink seemed to bleed into her skin, a permanent stain of failure. On the sidewalk below, her two children, 10-year-old Lucas and 6-year-old Sophie, stood beside a single battered suitcase held together with rope. The sounds of the city, the distant wail of a siren, the impatient honking of cars, were a deafening roar that drowned out her ability to think. Her heart pounded a frantic, painful rhythm against her ribs, and a wave of nausea rose in her throat. She felt her world, once a vibrant tapestry of love and simple dreams, unraveling into a single, terrifying thread. Her hand went instinctively to her pocket, feeling for the only tangible thing she had left in the world. It wasn't much. A single $20 bill, folded into a tight, tiny square. She could feel its worn creases, a pathetic testament to a life savings obliterated by a disease without mercy. Every last cent, every coin scraped from the bottom of a jar, every dollar earned from late nights hunched over her sewing machine, had been sacrificed to the sterile, beeping altars of the hospital. It was a battle they had fought with everything they had, and a battle they had lost. Now, the ghost of that cost lingered as a constant, gnawing ache in her stomach. It was a hunger she had grown accustomed to, a hollow pain she would ignore as she split a can of soup between her children, telling them she had already eaten. The memory of her husband's last days, of the mountain of bills that grew as he shrank, was a wound that refused to close. And now this single piece of paper in her pocket felt more like an insult than a resource, a cruel joke played by a merciless fate. Helen forced herself to look down at her children. And the sight was a physical blow. Lucas, her serious 10-year-old, was trying so hard to be the man of the family. He stood stiffly, his small jaw set in a determined line, his hand gripping his little sister's with a fierce protectiveness. But she could see the tremor in his lower lip, the fear swimming in his wide, dark eyes that were so much like his father's. And Sophie, sweet, innocent Sophie, clutched a threadbare teddy bear to her chest, her thumb in her mouth. She looked up at Helen, her voice small and hopeful. "Mommy, are we going to our new adventure now?" she asked. The question hung in the cold air, a perfect, crystalline moment of childhood trust that shattered Helen's heart into 1,000 pieces. A lie felt like acid rising in her throat, but she forced a smile that felt like cracking glass. Yes, sweetie, a new adventure. She felt a suffocating wave of failure wash over her. What kind of mother stood on a street corner with her babies, with no roof to offer them, no food for their bellies, and nothing but a lie for comfort? It had been a year since Mark died, a year of holding her breath, a year of walking on a tightrope over a chasm of grief and debt. Now she was finally falling. The loneliness was a physical weight, a crushing presence in the space beside her where her husband should have been. She could almost hear his voice, calm and steady, telling her it would be okay. He would have known what to do. He would have wrapped his arms around her and the children, a solid wall against the world. But there was only silence, a profound, deafening silence that made the city noises feel even more hostile and alien. The wind picked up, whipping a stray strand of hair across her face, and it felt like an icy finger tracing the path of a tear she refused to let fall. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. She was the captain of a sinking ship, and the ocean was vast and dark, and she had forgotten how to swim. The daylight began to fade, the sky bruising from grey to a deep, ominous purple. Streetlights flickered on one by one, casting long skeletal shadows on the pavement that seemed to reach for her and the children. The question, the one she had been pushing away for hours, now screamed in her mind. Where would they sleep tonight? A homeless shelter? A park bench? The thought sent a jolt of pure animal panic through her. She looked at Lucas's pale face, and at Sophie, who was now leaning her sleepy head against Helen's leg, a trusting, innocent weight. The future wasn't a path or a road. It was a black, gaping maw. The thread of a miracle she had been desperately praying for was gone. There was only the cold concrete under her feet, the encroaching darkness of the night, and the terrifying reality that the future of her children hung by the last frayed fiber of hope. Just as the last glimmer of light threatened to surrender to the encroaching night, her phone, a cheap prepaid model with a cracked screen, buzzed with a call from an unknown number. Hesitantly, she answered. The voice on the other end was raspy and unfamiliar, a distant cousin she hadn't spoken to in over a decade. The words tumbled out, a mix of awkward condolences and rushed information. A great-aunt she'd never even met had passed away. There was no money, the cousin clarified quickly, but Helen was the sole heir to her only property, a small plot of land and a barn in the countryside. The word property echoed in the hollow chamber of her despair. It was a tangible word, a solid word, a flicker of warmth, the first she'd felt in a year, ignited in her chest. She felt her heart give a painful, hopeful lurch. A roof. It might just be a roof. A desperate, fragile hope began to blossom in the barren landscape of her soul, and for a moment she allowed herself to breathe. She looked at the crumpled $20 bill in her palm. It was the last physical remnant of their former life, the final barrier between her family and absolute destitution. The cousin's words swirled in her head. It's not much, but it's a place. A place. The two words were a siren song. In her mind's eye, she saw a simple, rustic structure, a dry floor, a shield against the wind and rain. The image was a powerful narcotic, potent enough to eclipse the monumental risk. She made the decision in a heartbeat. Her stomach clenched with a knot of terror and wild elation. Turning to the children, she knelt, forcing a bright smile. Guess what? We're going on a real adventure now. We're going to our very own place in the country. Sophie's tired face lit up, and she clapped her hands. Lucas just watched her, his 10-year-old eyes full of a heavy, silent questioning, as if he could already sense the fragility of the dream she was spinning from their last few dollars. The bus station was a chaotic symphony of human misery and transit. The air, thick with the acrid smell of diesel fumes and the lingering scent of stale coffee, felt heavy in her lungs. She pushed through the shuffling crowds, a child's hand in each of hers, and made her way to the ticket counter. 3 one-way tickets to Harmony Creek, she said, her voice barely a whisper. The name sounded like a promise of everything she'd lost. She slid the $20 bill under the glass, watching as the cashier took it and returned only a few coins and 3 flimsy paper tickets. The finality of the transaction made her feel lightheaded. Holding the tickets, her hand trembled. They felt simultaneously like a passport to a new life and a signed confession of her recklessness. She ushered the children toward the boarding gate, the rhythmic thump of her own heart, a frantic drumbeat counting down to either salvation or ruin, with no space in between. The journey was a long, rumbling purgatory. The constant, monotonous drone of the bus's engine became the soundtrack to her churning thoughts, a low hum that vibrated through the worn velvet of her seat and up into her bones. Outside the grimy window, the familiar, harsh geometry of the city slowly softened, bleeding into the dark, rolling shapes of the countryside. Streetlights and skyscrapers gave way to isolated farmhouses and vast, empty fields cloaked in darkness. Sophie, exhausted from the day's trauma, had fallen asleep with her head in Helen's lap, her small body a warm, trusting weight. Helen gently stroked her daughter's hair, watching the rhythmic rise and fall of her chest. With every mile that separated them from the city, she felt a layer of tension peel away. It was the fragile, deceptive feeling of escape, the sense that she was outrunning her problems, leaving the battlefield of her failure far behind in the disappearing city lights. Lucas sat silently beside her, his small face illuminated by the intermittent glow of passing headlights. He hadn't said a word for almost an hour, his gaze fixed on the dark, blurry landscape rushing past the window. Finally, he turned to her, his voice small but clear against the engine's drone. "Mom," he asked, "will our new place have a yard? A real one?" The simple question was a dagger to her heart. She swallowed the lump in her throat and painted a picture for him with her words, a fantasy she desperately wanted to believe in herself. "Yes, honey, a big green yard, with lots of room to run and play. Maybe there will even be a big tree to climb." The lie felt both sweet and perilous on her tongue. She was building a castle of hope in the air for her son, and she knew, with a sickening certainty, that the higher she built it, the more devastating the fall would be if the foundation proved to be nothing but dust. The brakes of the bus hissed, pulling Helen from her reverie. The driver's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing a stop that was little more than a name on a signpost by the side of a deserted two-lane road. Harmony Creek. This was it. They were the only ones to disembark. As they stepped down onto the gravel shoulder, the bus door sighed shut behind them, and with a roar of its engine, the vehicle pulled away. Its red taillights dwindled in the distance, two malevolent eyes shrinking into the oppressive darkness until they were gone completely. The sudden, profound silence that descended was shocking. It wasn't peaceful. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket. The air was thick and cool, carrying the overpowering scent of damp earth, wet leaves, and something else, something wild and faintly feral. A shiver that had nothing to do with the cold evening air traced its way down Helen's spine. They were utterly, terrifyingly alone. Clutching the crude or hand-drawn map her cousin had texted her, Helen led the children down the cracked asphalt road. The single suitcase, its one remaining wheel bumping and rattling over rocks and potholes, made a noise that seemed obscenely loud in the crushing quiet of the countryside. After a few hundred yards, the asphalt gave way to a muddy, overgrown dirt track. Towering, unfamiliar trees formed a dense canopy overhead, their gnarled branches reaching down like skeletal fingers, blocking out the last vestiges of twilight. The path was slick with wet leaves. With each step, the fragile hope she had so carefully nurtured during the bus ride began to wither. A cold, creeping dread started to seep into her bones, a primal fear of the vast, indifferent darkness that surrounded them. Her heart, which had fluttered with anticipation, now began to thud with a slow, heavy rhythm of foreboding. The air grew colder, and the woods seemed to press in on them from all sides. They rounded a sharp bend in the path, and her breath caught in her throat. There, set back from the track, was the property. The sight was a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. This wasn't a quaint plot of land, it was a savage, untamed thicket. Weeds as tall as Lucas choked the landscape, and thorny vines snaked over everything, creating a dense, impenetrable wall of green and brown. A rusted, broken barbed wire fence sagged between crooked posts, listing like the last remnants of a shipwreck. And in the center of this desolation, silhouetted against the bruised purple of the twilight sky, was the barn. It bore no resemblance to the rustic, charming image she had clung to. It was a jagged, broken-toothed monster, a dark shape hunched against the horizon. The dream she had sold to her children, the dream she had sold to herself, was already beginning to rot before her very eyes. As they drew closer, pushing through the scratchy weeds, the horrific details sharpened into focus. This was not a barn. It was the carcass of one. Its wooden walls were a patchwork of splintered, graying planks and dark, gaping holes. Large sections of the roof had completely collapsed, leaving its internal structure exposed to the elements like broken ribs. One entire wall leaned inward at a terrifyingly precarious angle, looking as though a single strong gust of wind would be enough to bring the entire edifice crashing down into a pile of rotten timber. Helen's steps faltered, her boots sinking into the soft, muddy ground. She felt Sophie's hand tighten in hers, a small, frightened anchor in a sea of rising panic. The hopeful vision of a safe haven, of a simple roof, disintegrated into a cruel joke. This wasn't a home. It was a tombstone marking the grave of a long-dead farm. Then the smell hit them. It rolled out of the barn's dark maw in a thick, almost visible wave, a physical assault on their senses that made Helen gag. It was a complex and nauseating perfume of decay. The primary note was the cloying, gag-inducing odor of years of dampness and rot, the deep, earthy stench of mildew that had surely colonized every square inch of the structure. Layered underneath was the sharp, acrid reek of ammonia from countless animal droppings, likely from generations of rats and birds who had claimed this ruin as their own. It was the smell of neglect, of death, of a place utterly abandoned by life. Sophie whimpered and buried her face in the fabric of Helen's coat, her small body trembling. A hot, bitter wave of nausea surged up Helen's throat, and she had to swallow hard to keep from being sick, right there in the mud. This smell was not just unpleasant, it was a warning. The massive front doors, or what was left of them, hung unevenly from single, rust-eaten hinges. With a deep breath that only filled her lungs with more of the foul air, Helen put her shoulder to one and pushed. The door protested with a long, agonized shriek of tortured metal and scraping wood, a sound that seemed to echo the cry in her own soul. The gloom inside was even more forbidding than the exterior had promised. The floor was a treacherous, uneven landscape of packed dirt, broken boards, and piles of unidentifiable debris. What might have once been hay was now a series of matted, decomposing clumps, crawling with insects that scattered as the weak light from the doorway touched them. The air within the barn was frigid and heavy, so damp it felt like they were breathing water. It was a cold that sank straight through their clothes and into their marrow, a chilling pronouncement of the building's utter uninhabitability. Her eyes slowly adjusted to the deep twilight inside the derelict structure, and the details of their new reality became horrifyingly clear. From a gaping hole in the center of the roof, water dripped with a slow, maddeningly rhythmic plink-plink-plink into a stagnant, scummy puddle of black sludge on the floor below. The sound was a form of water torture, each drop a tiny hammer blow against her sanity. In the deeper shadows along the walls, she saw them, the sleek, dark shapes of rats, their beady eyes glinting in the gloom. The faint, constant sound of their tiny claws scratching on wood was an unnerving, skittering soundtrack to her despair. A cold, mournful draught whistled through the 1,000 cracks and holes in the walls, a ghostly sigh that seemed to mock their foolish arrival. This wasn't a shelter. It was a living, breathing organism of decay, and it was actively trying to repel them. Lucas, who had been so brave and stoic for so long, finally broke. A small, choked sound escaped his lips, a gasp of pure disbelief. In the faint light, his face was a pale mask of shock and fear. "Mom," he whispered, his voice trembling so hard the words were barely coherent. We can't stay here. It's not safe." His plea was not a complaint. It was a simple, terrified statement of fact. At his words, Sophie's fragile composure shattered completely. She began to cry, not loudly, but with a thin, heartbroken wail that sliced through Helen more effectively than any knife. "I want to go home, Mummy," she sobbed, her small fists clutching at the fabric of Helen's jeans. "I want to go home." The words echoed in the cavernous, rotting space, but there was no home to go to. That door had been locked forever. That life was over. The cruel irony was that this desolate ruin was now the only home they had in the entire world. The last stubborn embers of hope were extinguished, instantly doused by a flood of icy despair. It settled in her stomach like a block of granite, a cold, heavy weight of absolute failure. This wasn't a roof over their heads. It was a death trap. It was a cold, dangerous, disease-infested ruin that was infinitely worse than the anonymous misery of a city homeless shelter. She could see it all so clearly now. The distant cousin's phone call hadn't been a lifeline. It had been a convenient way to offload a worthless, hazardous property. A wave of white-hot rage at the cousin, at her late husband, at God, at herself, washed over her, and then receded just as quickly, leaving behind the black, silty residue of utter hopelessness. She had gambled their last dollar on a fantasy, and she had lost. She hadn't just failed her children, she had actively endangered them, leading them into this nightmare with a smile on her face and a lie on her lips. Without even realizing she was moving, her knees buckled. She sank down onto the filthy, debris-strewn floor, heedless of the dirt and grime that stained her jeans. The physical act of kneeling felt appropriate, a surrender to the overwhelming weight of her defeat. She pulled her 2 weeping children into her arms, hugging them tightly against her body, as if she could somehow shield them from the horror of the place with her own flesh. Their small bodies trembled violently against hers. The deep silence of the isolated countryside, which had seemed so full of promise on the bus, now felt vast and predatory, the silence of a tomb. There was no one to call for help. There was nowhere to run. The bus was a distant memory. Their money was gone. Their options were zero. Here, in the stinking, crumbling carcass of a forgotten barn, surrounded by a hostile darkness, Helen finally understood. This wasn't rock bottom. This was a grave she had dug with her own foolish hands. An hour, or perhaps an eternity, passed in the cold, stinking darkness. The initial violent wave of despair had crashed over Helen, leaving her exhausted and numb, adrift in its wake. But the persistent, shivering cold of her children's bodies pressed against her own was a stark reminder that surrender was not an option. She couldn't let them sleep here. on this filth-caked ground. A primal instinct, the fierce, unthinking drive of a mother protecting her young, began to stir in her soul. She felt a grim resolve harden within her. This place was a nightmare, but it was their nightmare now. She had to carve out a single, defensible corner of it. A tiny island in this sea of decay. Her gaze fell upon a section of the floor that seemed slightly less cluttered, marginally more protected from the dripping water. It would have to do. The first step was to simply make a space where they could lie down together without touching something wet or crawling. She rose to her feet, her joints aching from the cold and the cramped position. The first task felt monumental: cleaning. With no tools, she improvised, grabbing a wide, flat piece of a broken plank to use as a makeshift broom. As she began to sweep, the scraping sound of wood against the compacted dirt floor was grating and loud in the oppressive silence. A cloud of fine, choking dust rose into the air, carrying with it the ancient, layered smells of the barn. It was the scent of dry rot, of petrified animal droppings, and the ghostly, musty odor of hay that had long since turned to powder. Each push of the plank revealed another layer of filth, another testament to decades of neglect. She felt a lump form in her throat. She was literally sweeping away the dust of a dead dream, trying to create a livable space in a place where all life and hope had long since expired. The physical effort was grueling, but it was better than sitting still in the grip of fear. Lucas, ever her serious little man, seemed to understand. He stood up, wiping his tear-streaked face with the back of his sleeve, his small jaw set with a determination that mirrored her own. "I can help, Mom," he said, his voice still shaky but firm. He began picking up smaller pieces of debris, broken bits of terracotta, splinters of wood, rusted metal loops of unknown purpose, and moving them into a pile in the far corner. Sophie, still sniffling, watched him for a moment before following his lead, her tiny hands struggling to lift a soggy piece of old leather. A painful knot of love and guilt tightened in Helen's chest. They shouldn't be doing this. They should be in warm beds, tucked in after a story, not laboring in a cold, derelict tomb. But seeing them work, seeing their resilience, also fueled her own. They were a team, a broken, terrified, and homeless team, but a team nonetheless, and their shared struggle was a tiny spark in the crushing darkness. Suddenly, a flash of movement in the deepest shadows of the corner Lucas was clearing made Sophie shriek. It was a rat, not the skittering, shadow-dwelling creature she'd glimpsed before, but a large, bold one, its fur sleek and dark in the dim light. It darted out from behind a pile of rubble, paused for a terrifying second with its nose twitching and its black, beady eyes fixed on them, and then scurried across the open patch of floor Helen had just cleared. The sheer size of it, the audacity of its presence, sent a fresh wave of revulsion and fear through her. This wasn't just a place of decay, it was a place that was actively inhabited, a kingdom of vermin, and they were the unwelcome intruders. The rat was a living, breathing symbol of the filth and disease that surrounded them, a reminder of just how unsafe this place truly was for her children, for her family. Before Helen could even shout a warning, a primal, boyish instinct took over Lucas. A mixture of fear, disgust, and a desperate need to be the protector surged through him. He grabbed a long, sturdy-looking stick from the debris pile and, with a small battle cry, gave chase. "Get out!" he yelled, his voice cracking. "Get out of our home!" The rat, startled, bolted, heading for the opposite wall of the barn where the shadows were thickest. Helen's heart leaped into her throat. "Lucas! No! Stop!" "Just leave it," she cried out, her voice sharp with panic. She envisioned him tripping over some unseen hazard, falling onto a piece of rusted metal, or cornering the desperate animal and getting bitten. Her fear was a cold, metallic taste in her mouth as she started to move after him, her feet clumsy on the uneven ground, her mind racing with a dozen horrific possibilities. The rat was quick, a dark blur against the dirt floor. It led Lucas on a frantic chase toward the far side of the barn, a section shrouded in near-total darkness, where the wall leaned at its most precarious angle. He was so focused on his quarry, his eyes locked on the scurrying rodent, that he paid no attention to the ground beneath his feet. He raised the stick, preparing to swing it, and took one final, determined step. His foot came down on a section of floorboards that looked no different from any other, covered in the same layer of dust and grime. But they were not the same. They were a lie. A thin, brittle crust hiding a secret weakness, their integrity long since devoured by moisture and time. The flimsy illusion of solidity vanished in an instant, a perfect metaphor for the false hope that had brought them to this wretched place in the first place. The sound was not a creak, but a sharp, dry crack that echoed like a gunshot in the cavernous space. It was the sound of something old and brittle giving way completely. Lucas let out a short, sharp yelp, more of surprise than of pain, as the board beneath his foot disintegrated. His leg plunged downwards, and he fell forward, catching himself with his hands, the stick clattering uselessly to the ground. For a heart-stopping second, Helen's world went silent. All she could see was her son, half swallowed by the floor. A visceral, maternal terror seized her, so powerful it almost buckled her knees. She sprinted the last few feet, her mind a screaming void, convinced she was about to find him impaled on some hidden spike or with a broken bone, another disaster to add to their litany of suffering. "Lucas, are you hurt?" she gasped, her voice raw with fear. She reached him and dropped to her knees, her hands frantically checking his leg, his arms, his face. "I'm okay, Mom," he said, his voice shaky, his eyes wide with shock. "I'm okay." Relief washed over Helen so intensely it made her feel dizzy. He was fine, but as her panic subsided, she registered what her terrified mind had initially missed. Where Lucas's foot had gone through the floor, there wasn't the damp, packed earth she expected to see. There was nothing, just a dark, rectangular void, a hollow space. It was a deliberate, man-made cavity, hidden beneath the floorboards. She carefully helped Lucas pull his leg free and scoot away from the hole. Her fear for her son was slowly being replaced by a new, prickling sensation. It was a sliver of intense, unexpected curiosity, a question mark rising in the fog of her despair. Why would there be a hidden compartment under the floor of a ruined barn? Helen peered into the jagged opening. The air that drifted up was different from the barn's ambient stench of mold and dampness. This air was dry, cool, and smelled only of dust and enclosed space. Her heart began to beat a little faster, a tentative, questioning rhythm. With a new sense of purpose, she reached into the hole, her fingers carefully breaking away the remaining splinters of the rotten board, widening the opening. The wood crumbled in her hands, turning to little more than fibrous dirt. She made the hole large enough to see into, but the darkness inside was absolute. Taking a deep breath, she reached her hand down into the cold black space, her fingers blindly sweeping through the dust and cobwebs that coated the bottom. She wasn't sure what she was expecting to find. More dirt, a rat's nest. But then, her fingertips brushed against something that made her breath catch in her throat. Something cold, hard, and unmistakably metallic. Her fingers closed around the object. It was heavy, far heavier than a simple piece of junk metal. A strange thrill, a mix of trepidation and excitement, shot up her arm. She carefully pulled her hand back out of the hole, her fist clenched around her discovery. As she opened her palm under the faint grey light filtering through the doorway, her eyes widened. It was a key, an old large iron key, almost black with age and spotted with rust, but its form was elegant and deliberate. It felt substantial in her hand, its cold weight a grounding. Tangible reality in this place of decay and illusion. This was no ordinary key. It had an ornate, circular head, and in its center, a rustic, deeply stamped emblem that even the corrosion of time had not managed to erase completely. Her heart pounded against her ribs. This wasn't an accident. This was hidden. It was meant to be found. She held the key closer, rubbing the grime away from the emblem with her thumb. It was a design she had never seen before, but it was clear and distinct. The head of a longhorn steer, its horns wide and curving. The craftsmanship was old, rustic, yet filled with a sense of pride and identity. The key felt like a secret whispered from the distant past. Her mind, which had been consumed with the immediate horrors of their situation, suddenly shifted gears. A key, a hidden key, a powerful sense of purpose, something other than just survival, began to hum within her. A key implied a lock. A lock implied something of value, something worth protecting. For the first time since they had arrived, a feeling that was not despair or fear began to take root in her heart. It was a fragile, dangerous feeling, but it was undeniably there. Hope. A different kind of hope, not for a simple roof but for a hidden answer. Her first logical thought was to find the lock. She stood up, the heavy key clutched in her hand, and her eyes scanned the dilapidated barn. The main doors were a lost cause, their original hardware long since rusted away or broken. There was a smaller side door, but it hung ajar, its lock also destroyed. Her gaze fell on a large, metal-strapped storage bin in one corner, its lid secured by a thick, rusty padlock. A jolt of anticipation went through her. This must be it. She hurried over, the children watching her with wide, curious eyes. Her hand trembled slightly as she inserted the tip of the longhorn key into the padlock. It wouldn't go in. The keyhole was too small, a different shape entirely. A wave of disappointment, sharp and bitter, washed over her. Of course, it was just another cruel joke, another dead end, a useless key to a non-existent lock. She was about to hurl the key into the far corner of the barn to let it join the rest of the forgotten junk, when Lucas's small voice cut through her frustration. "Mom, look," he said, pointing not at a door or a lock, but at the massive stone feeding trough that was built directly into the foundation wall of the barn. It was a solid, imposing structure made of huge, roughly hewn blocks of grey stone, clearly as old as the barn itself. Helen followed his gaze, her eyes tracing the lines of ancient mortar, the patches of moss growing in the cracks, and then she saw it. Carved into the face of one of the largest stones, low to the ground and partially obscured by dirt, was an emblem. Her breath hitched. It was faded, weathered by a century of seasons, but it was unmistakable. The exact same longhorn steer. A jolt, like an electric current, shot through her. It wasn't a coincidence. It couldn't be. The key in her hand suddenly felt 10 times heavier, buzzing with a latent energy. This was the lock. Not a traditional lock, but a puzzle. The key was not meant to be inserted. It was a sign, a guide. She scrambled over to the trough, dropping to her knees on the cold stone floor in front of the carving. She ran her fingers over the rough, weathered surface of the longhorn emblem. The stone was cold and unyielding. She pushed on it, throwing her weight against it, but it didn't budge. It was a solid part of the wall. Or was it? She examined the edges more closely, scraping away the dirt and grime from the mortar lines. The crack around this particular stone seemed finer, more precise than the others, as if it was not meant to be permanent. She needed a lever. Her eyes darted around the cluttered floor, searching. The broken piece of floorboard Lucas had fallen through was too weak. It would just splinter. Her gaze then landed on a pile of discarded, rust-covered tools in the corner. She rummaged through them, her hands getting covered in orange-brown rust and grime, until she found it. A short, heavy iron pry bar. It was pitted and corroded, but it was solid steel. It felt like a weapon in her hand, a tool to unlock the past. She carried it back to the trough, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Sophie and Lucas huddled together a few feet away, their faces a mixture of awe and fear as they watched their mother, who seemed possessed by a strange new energy. This was no longer just about survival. It was about unearthing a secret. With a grunt of effort, she jammed the flattened tip of the pry bar into the thin crack just above the carved stone. She pushed. Nothing. The bar just scraped against the stone. She repositioned it, finding a better purchase in a corner where the mortar had crumbled away. She leaned into it, putting all of her weight, all of her frustration and desperate hope, into the effort. At first, there was only the groaning protest of metal against stone. Her muscles screamed in protest. Sweat beaded on her forehead, mingling with the grime. Then, she felt it. A slight give, a subtle shift. With a renewed surge of adrenaline, she pushed harder, rocking the bar back and forth. A low grinding scrape echoed in the barn, the sound of stone moving against stone for the first time in generations. With a final, jarring shudder, the mechanism gave way. The carved stone didn't fall out. It pivoted inward on a hidden, rust-caked hinge, revealing a dark, perfectly square opening in the foundation wall. A puff of dry, cool air, smelling of little more than aged dust and old paper, washed over her face. It was the scent of a space that had been sealed for a very, very long time. Helen stared, panting, into the cavity. It was a secret compartment, hidden in plain sight. Her mind reeled. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to build this, to hide something with immense care and ingenuity. The sheer cleverness of it, the Longhorn key leading to the Longhorn stone, spoke of a deep-seated fear and a desperate hope for the future. For a moment, she was frozen, caught between the world she was in and the world that was about to be revealed. Inside the dark hollow, something sat, waiting. It was a box, a heavy wooden chest, about 2 feet wide, bound with black iron straps that were dull but not deeply rusted, protected from the damp by its stone tomb. It wasn't a fantastical treasure chest, but a simple, brutally practical strongbox, built for security, not for show. Its presence was overwhelming, a solid, tangible piece of a forgotten story sitting right in front of her. She reached into the compartment, her hands closing around the sides of the chest. It was incredibly heavy, far heavier than an empty box had any right to be. With a grunt of exertion, she dragged it out of the wall and onto the dirt floor, the bottom scraping against the ground. It landed with a solid, satisfying thud that seemed to shake the very foundations of the barn and Helen's own reality. Now came the final test. The chest had a large, formidable iron lock on its front, and it had a keyhole that looked exactly right. Her hands were shaking so much she could barely hold the Longhorn key steady. She took a deep, calming breath, the musty air filling her lungs, and slid the key into the lock. It fit perfectly, a seamless, predestined connection. With her children watching in breathless silence, she turned the key. There was a loud, protesting groan of old metal, a series of satisfying clicks from within the lock's ancient mechanism, and then a final, definitive clunk as the bolt slid free. The lock was open. She paused for a single, heart-stopping moment, her hand hovering over the lid. What was inside? What secret had been waiting in the dark for all these years? The answer could change everything, or it could be another devastating disappointment. Slowly, she lifted the heavy lid. The inside of the barn was so dim that it took a moment for her eyes to register what she was seeing. But then, a soft, subtle glint of yellow caught the faint light, a warm, buttery gleam that was utterly alien in this world of grey decay. Her breath caught in her throat. She stared, unblinking, disbelief warring with a wild, nascent hope. Wrapped in pieces of what looked like old, threadbare cotton cloth were bars. Several of them. They were not iron. They were gold. Solid gold bars, nestled in the bottom of the chest like a dragon's hoard. It was the stuff of fantasy, of dreams, so impossible that she felt a wave of dizziness, as if the world had tilted on its axis. She could hear her own blood roaring in her ears, a sound that drowned out everything else. Her hand, trembling violently, reached into the chest. Her fingers, calloused from years of sewing and now caked with dirt, brushed against the smooth, cool surface of a gold bar. It was real. She lifted it. The weight was shocking, a dense, incredible heft that felt like it was trying to pull her arm back down to the earth. It was a weight of security, of safety, of a future. Tears, hot and sudden, sprang to her eyes and began to stream down her grimy cheeks. These were not tears of sorrow or despair, but of a kind of explosive, terrifying relief that was so immense it was painful. This gold could buy them a home. It could buy them food. It could buy them a life. A real one. Far from the desperation of the streets and the horror of this barn, it was a miracle. A real, solid gold miracle. But as she carefully placed the gold bar back into the chest, her fingers brushed against something else underneath the cloth wrappings, something flat and soft. Pushing the remaining bars aside, she saw it. A packet of documents, tied together with a brittle, faded length of silk ribbon. The papers were yellowed to the color of old parchment, their edges brown and crumbling. On top of the stack sat a small-eyed handsome book, bound in dark, cracked leather. A journal. A strange feeling washed over her, a sense that the gold, as miraculous as it was only the first part of the discovery. The gold was the means, but these papers were the reason. They hummed with an energy of their own, the quiet, powerful weight of a story waiting to be told. She carefully lifted the packet from the chest. The documents were fragile, seeming as though they might turn to dust in her hands. She could see the top sheet was a map, drawn in faded ink, its lines showing property boundaries and landmarks she didn't recognize. Beneath it was a folded vellum document bearing a dark, brittle wax seal that had cracked with age, a deed, perhaps. And then there was the journal. It felt different, personal. The leather cover was worn smooth in places, a sign that it had been held and written in many times. Her hands shaking, she untied the fragile ribbon and gently opened the journal to its first page. The smell of old paper, dry ink, and time itself rose to meet her. The handwriting inside was elegant, if a little faded, a looping cursive from a bygone era. This was the real treasure. The gold was a fortune. But this was a legacy. It was a voice from the past, deliberately preserved and hidden, waiting for a descendant to find it. Helen felt a profound sense of connection, not just to the objects in her hands, but to the person who had hidden them, a person who was her own flesh and blood. An ancestor she had never known had left this for her family. The weight of this realization was as heavy as the gold. It was a responsibility. This wasn't just a lucky find. It was an inheritance of a story, a burden of truth. A new loop of mystery had opened, far more compelling than the last. Who was this person? What story did these maps, this deed, and this journal have to tell? And why did they have to hide it all away with a fortune in gold? With the children huddled together under a thin blanket, finally asleep from sheer emotional and physical exhaustion, Helen lit a single candle she'd found in the suitcase, its tiny flame a fragile warrior against the crushing darkness. The flickering light cast long, dancing shadows that made the ruined barn seem alive and breathing around her. She sat on the cold dirt floor, the heavy wooden chest open before her, the gold bars gleaming with a sinister, otherworldly light. A profound tremor ran through her, a mixture of awe and a deep, gut-wrenching fear. This treasure was not a gift. She felt it in her bones. It was a burden, a secret that had been buried for a reason. Carefully, she set the gold aside, the cold weight of it sending a chill up her arm. Her focus was now solely on the packet of documents, on the leather-bound journal. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the chilling silence. This, she knew, held the truth. The story of why a man would bury a fortune and disappear from the world. It was time to listen to the ghost who had left it. She gently opened the journal, the cracked leather feeling impossibly old and fragile under her fingertips. The scent of dry paper and faint, faded ink rose to meet her, the perfume of a time long past. The first page was dated June 1968. The handwriting was strong and clear, belonging to a man named Thomas, her great-grandfather. As she began to read, a world unfolded from the looping script, a world of back-breaking work and boundless hope. Thomas wrote of buying this land, of the rich, dark soil, of the dream of building a legacy for his family. He described the barn not as the rotting corpse it was now, but as a proud new structure, smelling of fresh-cut pine and filled with the promise of future harvests. A lump formed in Helen's throat. She felt an eerie connection to this man, a shared dream of providing for their children on this very same plot of land. The ghost of his hope was a painful echo of her own, so recently shattered. She felt his pride and his ambition as if they were her own memories, a phantom limb of a life stolen. Helen's fingers, trembling slightly, turned the delicate, yellowed pages. For the first dozen entries, the journal was a simple chronicle of a homesteader's life, planting seasons, the birth of a foal, the digging of a well. But then the tone began to shift. The date was October 1969. A new name appeared, scrawled with a slightly heavier, more agitated hand, Cyrus Caldwell. "My new neighbor, Cyrus Caldwell, visited today," Thomas wrote. "He has the eyes of a hawk, always watching, always calculating. He complimented my land, but his words felt like stones in my hand." Helen felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. The name Caldwell resonated with a dark familiarity, a name she'd heard whispered on the bus, associated with the massive, prosperous farms that now dominated the entire region. She could feel her great-grandfather's unease seeping through the page, a subtle poison that began to taint the hopeful narrative. The open loop tightened. This was the beginning of the end. The shadow was falling. The entries grew shorter, more sporadic. The hopeful descriptions of crops and weather were replaced by accounts of unsettling incidents. A section of my fence was cut during the night. One entry read, "My prize bull was found sick this morning. The vet suspects poison." Thomas's confident script became tighter, more cramped, as if he were trying to contain a growing fear within the lines of the page. Helen felt her own breath catch in her chest, her body tensing as she read, sharing his anxiety across the decades. The sense of isolation he described was suffocating, a feeling she now understood with terrifying intimacy. He wrote of visiting the local sheriff, only to be dismissed, told it was likely just local hooligans or bad luck. The entry ended with a chilling sentence that made a shiver trace its way down Helen's spine. "I feel watched, even inside my own home. I feel his eyes on me. The law here wears a friendly face, but it answers to one man, Caldwell." Then came the final entry. It was dated April 1970. The handwriting was a near unreadable scrawl, the ink smudged in places as if by a shaking, sweaty hand. The words were a frantic, desperate confession. He will take it all. Caldwell made his final offer. It was not a negotiation. It was a threat. He wants my land, the water rights, everything. He said accidents happen, that a man alone with a family can easily disappear. I told him I would never sell. I see now that was a mistake. I have buried what I can for my family. The gold is for them to fight back someday. The deed and the maps are the proof of what is mine. What is theirs? God forgive me, he is coming. I can hear the truck on the road. The entry stopped there, abruptly. The rest of the page was blank. Helen stared at the empty lines, her blood running cold. She felt the silence of that final, unwritten moment. It was not the sound of a pen being put down. It was the sound of a life being extinguished. This wasn't a story. It was a murder confession written by the victim, her hands shaking violently. Helen unfurled the other documents. The deed was original, bearing the state seal from 1967, its vellum surface clearly outlining Thomas's 500-acre property. But it was the map that made her gasp, a strangled sound of disbelief escaping her lips. It was a detailed topographical survey of her great-grandfather's land, showing the fertile fields, the creek that provided ample water, and the exact placement of the barn and house. Laid over it, drawn in a different red ink, was another set of lines, a new property boundary. She recognized it immediately from the satellite view she had glanced at on her phone before they'd left the city, the prosperous, massive soybean farm that bordered this tiny, worthless plot. It wasn't bordering it, it was it. The red lines perfectly matched the modern boundaries of the Caldwell soybean empire. Her great-grandfather's entire 500-acre farm had been swallowed whole, leaving only this one derelict acre and a rotting barn, like a bone spit out after a feast. A wave of righteous fury, hot and fierce, surged through Helen, momentarily eclipsing her fear. It was all a lie. The story wasn't that her ancestor had failed and abandoned his farm. It was that he had been murdered for his success. This powerful, respected family, the Caldwells, were nothing but thieves and killers. Their entire empire built upon the foundation of her family's stolen land and spilled blood. The gold wasn't just savings, it was a war chest. The documents were the weapons, the weight of it all pressed down on her. Her great-grandfather had left this for his family, trusting that one day someone would return to reclaim their legacy and expose the truth, that someone was her. A broke, widowed seamstress with 2 small children, hiding in the ruins of the crime scene. A wave of nausea washed over her. It was an impossible task, a fight against a giant. The hope the gold had given her was souring into the metallic taste of terror. Just then, a sound from outside shattered the silence. It wasn't the natural sound of the country night, not the chirp of crickets or the hoot of an owl. It was the crunch of tires on gravel, slow and deliberate, followed by the low, powerful rumble of an expensive engine idling. Helen's heart instantly leaped into her throat, pounding like a trapped bird. Every muscle in her body went rigid. The sound was wrong. It was predatory. She quickly and silently pushed the journal and documents back into the chest, slammed the lid shut, and slid it back into its stone hiding place, pivoting the heavy block of stone back into position. Her movements were frantic but silent, driven by pure animal instinct. She grabbed a dusty old tarp from a corner and threw it over the stone, trying to make it look like just another pile of debris. Her breath was coming in ragged, shallow gasps. She felt her children stir behind her, and she motioned for them to be absolutely still. They were no longer alone. A car door closed. The sound was not a clang, but a solid, insulated thud, the sound of money and power. Heavy, confident footsteps approached the barn. They were not the tentative steps of a lost traveler. They were the steps of a man who owned the ground he walked on. Helen's blood turned to ice in her veins. She felt utterly exposed. A mouse frozen in the path of a snake. The main barn door, the one she had struggled to move, was pushed open with a groan. But this time it was shoved with an effortless strength that made her feel weak and small. A tall silhouette stood framed in the doorway, blocking the pale moonlight. For a moment, the figure was just a dark shape, a void of menace against the night sky. Then he stepped inside. He didn't carry a flashlight. He didn't need one. He moved with the easy familiarity of a man who was not afraid of the dark, or anything in it. A sick feeling of dread coiled in Helen's gut. He knew this place. The man who stepped into the candlelight was the physical opposite of the decay surrounding him. He was in his late 40s, tall and impeccably dressed in a tailored jacket, crisp shirted and polished leather boots that seemed immune to the filth on the ground. His face was handsome, with a strong jaw and cold, intelligent eyes that seemed to take in the entire scene in a single, dismissive glance. A disarming, placid smile played on his lips, but it didn't reach his eyes. Those eyes were flat and hard, like chips of grey slate. He stopped a few feet from her, his gaze sweeping over Helen and her sleeping children, lingering for a moment on their single, battered suitcase. "Well, hello there," he said, his voice smooth and cultured, but with an undercurrent of steel. "My name is Arthur Caldwell. My foreman told me we had some squatters move into the old barn. I just came to see for myself." The word squatters was a calculated insult, a clear statement of her powerlessness. Helen felt her throat tighten. The words she needed to say catching like burrs. She forced herself to her feet, placing her body between the man and her children. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, so loud she was sure he could hear it. This was him, Arthur Caldwell, the grandson, the heir to a stolen empire. She could feel the ghost of her great-grandfather's fear clinging to her like a shroud. She stared into the eyes of the man whose family had destroyed hers, and she saw the same predatory stillness Thomas had described. The air in the barn grew thick and heavy, charged with unspoken history and imminent danger. She felt a tremor start in her hands, and she balled them into fists to hide it. She had to be strong. She had to pretend she knew nothing. Her life and the lives of her children depended on the performance she was about to give. The gold and the journal felt like a burning weight in their hiding spot just a few feet away. "We're not squatters," Helen managed to say, her voice coming out as a rough, hoarse whisper. "This property, it was left to me. It belonged to my family." Arthur Caldwell's smile widened, but it became even colder, more condescending. He let out a soft, patronizing chuckle. "This old wreck, my dear lady, my family has owned all the land around here for generations. This little plot is a forgotten footnote, worthless for decades. I'm surprised someone even remembered it existed." His words were dismissive, designed to make her feel insignificant, to reinforce the idea that she had no claim to anything here. He took another step closer, his expensive cologne momentarily overpowering the stench of rot and mold. He was invading her space, a quiet act of dominance. "Look, I can see you're in a tough spot," he continued, his voice softening into a tone of false sympathy that made her skin crawl. "This place is dangerous. It's no place for a woman and her children." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a checkbook and a sleek, gold pen. The gesture was theatrical, designed to showcase his wealth and her poverty. "I tell you what," he said, clicking the pen, "I feel for you. I'm prepared to offer you $500 for this land. Cash it in. Get yourself and your kids a hot meal, a bus ticket somewhere safe, a fresh start. Think of it as a gift. $500. The amount was so insulting, so laughably small, it was a slap in the face. $500 for land that was the seed of a multi-million-dollar empire, for a legacy built on murder. A surge of white-hot rage burned in Helen's chest, so intense it almost made her choke. She wanted to scream at him, to throw the journal at his smug face, to tell him she knew he was the grandson of a murderer and a thief, but she saw the look in his eyes, a cold, assessing look. He was testing her. He wasn't offering to buy the land. He was trying to find out if she knew what was hidden on it. She swallowed the rage, pushing it down deep, burying it under a mask of weary defeat. She shook her head, forcing her voice to remain steady. "Thank you for the offer, Mr. Caldwell, but we have nowhere else to go. We'll make do here for now." She needed to buy time. Time to think. Time to figure out what to do with the explosive truth she now possessed. For a long moment, Arthur Caldwell just stared at her, his smile finally vanishing completely. The mask of the charming businessman fell away, and for a terrifying second she saw the predator underneath. His eyes narrowed, and a profound chill settled over the barn. The air crackled with menace. His gaze flickered from her, to the sleeping children, and then to the pile of debris where the chest was hidden. It was a look that said he knew. He might not have known what she'd found, but he knew she'd found something. The game was afoot, and he was making the first move. He slowly put the checkbook away, his movements deliberate and chillingly calm. He took a step back towards the door, but his eyes never left hers. "A stubborn woman," he said softly, the words hanging in the cold air like a puff of frozen breath. "That's a shame." He paused at the doorway, turning his head slightly. "You know," he mused, his voice casual, but laced with pure venom, "this is a very isolated area. Always has been. Back in my granddaddy's day, people used to say this land was cursed. Terrible things would happen, tragic accidents. People would just disappear." He let the word hang in the air, a loaded weapon pointed directly at her and her children. It was not a historical anecdote. It was a promise. Then he smiled that cold, dead smile one last time. "You be careful out here, especially with these little ones." He turned and walked away, the sound of his footsteps on the gravel receding into the night, leaving behind a silence that was far more terrifying than the noise had been. Helen stood frozen, her entire body trembling uncontrollably as the sound of his powerful engine faded into the distance. The threat echoed in the cavernous ruin, a poison that had now infected their only sanctuary. She wasn't just a broke widow anymore. She was a witness. She held the evidence to unravel a dynasty built on a bloody secret, and the dragon had just come to her door to tell her he knew she was there. The gold was no longer a path to salvation. It was a motive. The journal was not just a story. It was her own potential death sentence. She looked at her sleeping children, their innocent faces serene in the flickering candlelight, and a wave of terror so profound it felt like drowning washed over her. He had seen them. He had included them in his threat. What would you do in her place? Confront the powerful man who stole your family's legacy, or take the gold and run, hoping to disappear before history tragically and violently repeats itself? The silence Arthur Caldwell left behind was a living entity, a suffocating presence that pressed in on Helen from all sides. His final words, "People would just disappear," coiled in the cold air, a venomous serpent refusing to retreat. Her heart, which had been a frantic drum against her ribs, now felt like a block of ice lodged in her chest. She stood paralyzed in the center of the rotting barn, the feeble candlelight throwing her trembling shadow against the decaying walls, making it dance like a specter of her own imminent doom. Every natural sound of the night, the chirp of a cricket, the rustle of leaves, was now horribly magnified, twisted into the sound of approaching footsteps, of a truck engine returning. The cold from the dirt floor seemed to leach all the warmth from her body, a bone-deep chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. She felt a primal, animal terror, the fear of prey that knows the predator is circling, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. This was no longer a shelter, it was a cage, and the door had just been locked from the outside. Slowly, as if moving through deep water, Helen sank to her knees. The rough texture of the dirt floor, the sharp edges of small pebbles, barely registered through the numbness that had enveloped her. Her gaze was fixed on the crude pile of debris covering the stone that hid her terrible secret. The gold and the journal, which hours ago had felt like a miracle, a key to a new life, now felt like a radioactive core, poisoning everything around them, drawing death and violence towards her small family. Caldwell's visit was no coincidence. He knew. He must have had this place watched for years, waiting for an heir to stumble into his trap. The thought sent a fresh wave of nausea through her. She was not a discoverer, she was the bait, and her children, sleeping so trustingly just a few feet away, were caught in the trap with her. A single, silent tear carved a clean path through the grime on her cheek, a hotline of despair in the suffocating cold. The hope she had so briefly held was a cruel mirage. She crawled over to her sleeping children, her movements agonizingly slow, as if a great weight were pressing down on her spine. She gently pulled the thin, scratchy blanket up to their chins, her hand lingering on Lucas's forehead, then on Sophie's soft hair. Their peaceful, innocent faces were a stark, painful contrast to the violent turmoil raging inside her. Caldwell's threat had not been abstract. It had been a direct, calculated blow aimed at them. "Especially with these little ones," he had said, the words replaying in her mind. Each repetition a fresh twist of the knife in her gut. A fierce, protective rage began to burn through the ice of her fear. It was a mother's rage, ancient and absolute. She would not let him harm them. She would not let them become another tragic accident in the bloody history of this land. But how could she fight a man like that? A man who could make people disappear, a man whose family owned the law itself. She felt impossibly small, a tiny insect in the path of a relentless machine. The hours before dawn were an eternity of listening. Helen sat with her back pressed against the cold stone of the foundation, her body rigid, her ears straining to pass every sound from the oppressive darkness. The wind whistling through the cracks in the walls sounded like whispers. The scuttling of a rat in the rafters was the click of a hammer on a gun. She clutched the heavy, cold iron pry bar in her lap, its weight a pathetic comfort. What could she do with it against a man like Caldwell, or the men he would surely send? She thought of the journal, of her great-grandfather's last, frantic words. He had faced the same evil, the same suffocating dread. He had hidden his treasure and his story, hoping someone would one day finish the fight. That day was now. The responsibility settled upon her, not as a choice, but as a destiny she could not escape. Running felt like a betrayal. Staying felt like a death sentence. The weight of the gold and the truth were crushing her. As the first, pale, grey light of dawn began to seep through the holes in the roof, a grim resolve began to harden in Helen's soul. She couldn't stay here. Caldwell had found her. This barn was no longer a hiding place. It was a target. Every passing moment increased the danger. She needed help, but the nearest town was miles away, and her great-grandfather's journal had made it chillingly clear that the local sheriff was a puppet of the Caldwell family. To go there would be to walk directly into the lion's den, to hand her evidence and her life over to the enemy. Her mind raced, desperately sifting through the meager scraps of information she had. The cousin on the phone. What had he said? A vague mention of an old man. A neighbor who lived a few miles down the road. Silas. It was a sliver of a chance, a desperate, flimsy thread of possibility. He would be old. He might have known her family. He might know the truth. It was a wild gamble, but it was the only one she had left. The decision made, a new kind of fear took hold. The fear of action. She had to leave the barn, leave the relative, if illusory, safety of its walls, and expose herself and her children to the open road. The image of Caldwell's cold eyes, of his expensive car cruising down the isolated roads, made her stomach clench. He could be anywhere, watching. She looked at the hidden compartment. The gold was too heavy, too dangerous to carry. It had to stay. But the proof, the story, that was her only weapon. She gently woke the children. Their sleepy, confused faces were a fresh stab of guilt. "We're going for a little walk," she whispered, forcing a calm she did not feel into her voice. "We're going to visit a neighbor." Lucas, old enough to sense the tension in the air, just nodded, his eyes wide and serious. Sophie whimpered, clutching her teddy bear, confused by this new, sudden departure from their grim new home. Helen felt like a general leading her tiny, terrified army on a suicide mission. Her hands trembled as she retrieved the journal and the deed from the chest, the dry paper feeling both fragile and immensely powerful. She wrapped them carefully in a spare piece of cloth and tucked them deep inside her worn handbag, zipping it shut. The bag felt impossibly heavy now, not with physical weight, but with the burden of 50 years of silence, of murder and theft. She left the gold bars nestled in their wooden tomb, resealing the stone compartment and scattering debris over the spot with frantic, quiet haste. It was a calculated risk. The gold was a fortune, but the story was priceless. Without the journal, the gold was just a treasure for Caldwell's thugs to steal. With the journal, it was evidence, a war chest for a fight for justice. She took one last look around the rotting barn, this place of shattered hopes and terrifying revelations. Then, holding each child's hand in a vice-like grip, she stepped out into the misty, uncertain morning light, feeling 1,000 unseen eyes on her back. The walk was a grueling ordeal of paranoia. The dirt road stretched before them, a long exposed ribbon flanked by dense, watchful woods. Every snap of a twig, every caw of a crow, sent a jolt of adrenaline through Helen's exhausted body. She found herself constantly scanning the tree line, searching for any sign of movement, for the glint of sun on a windshield. After half a mile, Sophie began to cry, her small legs too tired to continue. Without a word, Helen hoisted her onto her hip, the child's added weight a punishing burden on her already aching frame. Sophie's head rested on her shoulder, her warm breath a comfort and a terrible responsibility. Lucas walked silently beside her, his small hand still clutching hers, his face a mask of stoic worry. The sun climbed higher in the sky, burning off the morning mist and beating down on them. Sweat trickled down Helen's back, her thin cardigan providing no relief. The air was thick with the scent of dust and pine, but all she could smell was her own fear. They walked for what felt like an eternity, the miles blurred into a monotonous rhythm of trudging feet and the heavy, rasping sound of her own breathing. The hope of finding Silas's house began to feel as foolish and insubstantial as the dream of the barn had been. Maybe he had moved. Maybe he had died years ago. Maybe he never existed at all. Just a garbled memory from a distant cousin. Despair began to gnaw at the edges of her resolve. Her legs burned, her arms ached from carrying Sophie, and the relentless sun was making her feel dizzy. She was just about to give up, to turn back and resign herself to her fate in the barn, when Lucas pointed. "Mum, look," he shouted, his voice hoarse. "Smoke?" She followed his gaze. Far down the road, almost hidden by a bend and a copse of tall trees, a thin, delicate plume of white smoke rose straight up into the blue sky. It was a sign of life, a chimney, a home. A new, fragile tendril of hope unfurled in her chest, giving her the strength to quicken her pace. As they rounded the bend, they saw it. It was a small, modest house, its whitewashed walls faded and peeling, its porch slightly crooked, but it was clean, cared for. A neat vegetable garden grew to one side, and pots of bright red geraniums lined the porch railing, defiant splashes of color against the weathered wood. It felt like an island of gentle order in a sea of wild, untamed country. The sight was so welcoming, so profoundly normal, that it brought a fresh wave of tears to Helen's eyes. This was a place where life went on, where someone tended to a garden and lit a fire in the morning. An old, beat-up pickup truck, its paint faded to a patchwork of primer and rust, was parked near the side of the house, and sitting on the porch in a rocking chair, a small cloud of wood shavings at his feet, was an old man. He looked up as they approached, his hands, busy with a piece of wood and a small knife, falling still. His eyes, clear and sharp, watched them come. Helen's heart hammered against her ribs as she led her children up the short, dusty path to the house. The old man on the porch didn't move, just watched them with a quiet, unnerving stillness. He looked ancient, his face a roadmap of deep wrinkles, his skin tanned to the color of worn leather by a lifetime of sun. His hair was a shock of thick, snow-white floss, and a pair of faded denim overalls hung loosely on his thin, wiry frame. He looked like a man who had sprung directly from the earth he lived on. As she got closer, she saw that his eyes, beneath bushy white brows, were not clouded with age but were startlingly alert and intelligent. They held a deep, profound sadness, the look of a man who had seen too much. He placed his whittling knife and the piece of wood carefully beside his chair, his gaze never leaving Helen's face. He knew she wasn't a lost traveler. He knew she was there for a reason. The air was thick with unspoken questions. "Are you Silas?" Helen asked, her voice barely a whisper. The name seemed to hang in the air for a moment. The old man gave a slow, deliberate nod, his ancient eyes searching her face, then her children's, as if looking for a ghost of a resemblance he might recognize. "I am," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp, like stones tumbling in a slow-moving creek. "And you must be Thomas's blood. I can see it in the boy's eyes." The words hit Helen with the force of a physical blow. Thomas's blood. He knew. He remembered. The desperate gamble had paid off. A wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled, her knees washed over her. She didn't have to explain everything from the beginning. He was a part of the story. She opened her handbag, her fingers fumbling with the zipper in her haste. "Then you need to see this," she said, her voice trembling as she pulled out the cloth-wrapped journal. "I found it. In the barn." The old man's face, a mask of placid wrinkles, crumbled. Silas stared at the leather-bound journal as if he were looking at a ghost. His gnarled, arthritic hands reached out, trembling slightly, and he took the book from her with a reverence that was heartbreaking to witness. He ran his thumb over the cracked leather cover, his eyes clouding with memories from a lifetime ago. He didn't need to open it. He knew what it was. "Thomas's journal," he whispered, the words catching in his throat. "I watched him write in it. Every evening at his kitchen table." He looked up at Helen, and she saw that his clear eyes were now shimmering with unshed tears. "He was a good man," Silas said, his voice thick with an ancient grief. "The best man I ever knew. He gave me my first real job, treated me like a son." He finally opened the book, his fingers tracing the elegant, faded script on the first page. A single tear escaped and rolled down his wrinkled cheek, disappearing into the white stubble on his jaw. The past was not dead. It was sitting on this porch, weeping. He spent a long time turning the pages, his expression a mixture of fond remembrance and deepening sorrow. He would nod slowly at certain passages, a faint, sad smile touching his lips. Then his jaw would tighten as he read about the arrival of Cyrus Caldwell. He didn't need to read the final, frantic entry. He knew how it ended. He lived it. He finally closed the journal, placing it gently on his lap. "It's all true," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of 50 years of silence. Every word of it. Cyrus was a monster, a smiling snake who wanted everything Thomas had built. The land, the waters, everything. He bled this county dry with fear. He looked out over the fields, his gaze lost in the haze of the past. Helen felt a sense of vindication so powerful, it was dizzying. She wasn't crazy. The journal wasn't a fantasy. It was a testimony, and now she had a living witness to corroborate it. But she could sense there was more, a darker secret still buried beneath the old man's grief. "There's something else, isn't there?" Helen asked softly, her voice barely disturbing the heavy silence. The journal stops. It doesn't say what happened. Silas flinched, as if her words had struck an unhealed wound. He stared down at his gnarled hands, at the prominent, blue veins that stood out like rivers on a map. He took a long, shuddering breath, the air whistling in his lungs. For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer, that the secret was too heavy to be spoken aloud. When he finally looked up, his eyes were filled with a haunted, faraway look, the eyes of a young boy trapped in a century-old body. "He didn't just disappear, girl," Silas whispered, his voice cracking. "I saw it. I was just a boy, not much older than your own son there. I was supposed to be home, but I'd forgotten my jacket in the stables. I was hiding, scared of getting in trouble for being out so late." His voice dropped even lower, to a conspiratorial, terrified whisper that chilled Helen to the bone. "I heard the truck," he continued, his eyes wide, reliving the moment. "Not on the main road. It came through the back fields, just like a predator. It was Caldwell's truck. I heard shouting. It wasn't just an argument, it was ugly. I heard your great-grandfather yell no just once. Then nothing, just a sickening thud. The sound of something heavy hitting the ground. I was so scared I thought my heart would stop. I crammed my fist in my mouth to keep from screaming." He paused, swallowing hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his thin, wrinkled throat. Helen found she was holding her breath, her own heart pounding in a frantic rhythm that matched the old man's terror. Lucas and Sophie, sensing the gravity of the moment, had fallen silent, their small faces pale as they watched the old man recount his nightmare. The air grew cold, despite the hot sun, as the ghost of that terrible night descended upon the small porch. The final loop was about to close. "I saw them from my hiding spot, in the trees," Silas rasped, his gaze unfocused, seeing the past. Cyrus and 2 of his hired men, they weren't just standing there. They were dragging something from the house towards the property line. It was a body, wrapped in a canvas tarp. I couldn't see a face, but I knew it was Thomas. The confession hung in the air, a monstrous, unbelievable truth finally spoken aloud after half a century. They were clumsy, breathing hard. They were scared, too. Murder is heavy work. Silas's voice was flat, devoid of emotion. The voice of someone who has replayed a scene so many times it has lost its sharp edges, leaving only a deep, permanent stain on the soul. Helen felt a wave of dizziness, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a gasp. The abstract crime from the journal was now horrifyingly real, painted in blood and darkness by the memory of a terrified boy who had never been able to forget the sound of his friend and mentor being dragged to an unmarked grave. There's a massive old oak tree," Silas said, his voice gaining a strange, new clarity as he described the location, a map etched into his memory, right on the old property line, where the Caldwell land begins now. It's the oldest tree in the county, struck by lightning once but still standing. A giant. They buried him there, right at its roots. He pointed with a trembling finger, not at anything in the distance, but into the landscape of his mind. I watched them dig. The sound of the shovels, and that's a sound a boy never forgets. The soft thud of the steel hitting the dirt. It went on for what felt like hours. When they were done, they packed the earth down, threw leaves and branches over it, like it never happened. Then they drove away, and the world just got quiet. The wrong kind of quiet. He finally looked at Helen, his eyes begging for a kind of absolution she could not give. I was a child. I was terrified. I ran home and never told a soul. I've carried that silence like a stone in my gut for 50 years. The weight of his confession settled over them, a physical presence. The final piece of the puzzle had clicked into place. The journal, the deed, the gold, and now this. An eyewitness. An eyewitness who knew where the body was buried. They had everything. The story was complete. A surge of fierce, triumphant energy shot through Helen. Momentarily banishing her fear, they could prove it. They could actually prove it all, the land, the murder, everything. But her triumph was immediately tempered by Silas's next words. "Arthur Caldwell was here," she said, her voice flat and hard. "Last night. He threatened me. He threatened my children." Silas's face, which had been lost in the grief of the past, snapped back to the present. The sadness in his eyes was replaced by a sharp, cold fear. "Arthur," he breathed. "Then it's starting again. He knows you're here. He knows you won't leave. He's not his grandfather, Helen. He won't get his own hands dirty, but he's just as ruthless. He won't let 50 years of lies be dug up. Not for anything." "He'll be back," Silas said, his voice urgent, his entire demeanor changing from a grieving storyteller to a hardened strategist. "And he won't come with a checkbook this time. He'll send men who don't ask questions. They'll be there to find whatever he thinks you found, and to make sure you can't tell anyone about it." The old man's words painted a grim, terrifyingly plausible picture. The threat wasn't for some distant future. It was imminent. It was for tonight. "You can't go to the local police," he continued, thinking aloud, his mind working quickly. "They've been in the Caldwell's pocket since before you were born. The sheriff's salary is just a retainer from the soybean farm. You'd be signing your own death warrant." The trap was closing in, every conventional avenue of escape blocked by the long shadow of the Caldwell family's power. They were on an island, and the tide of violence was rising fast around them. Helen felt her brief moment of triumph evaporate, replaced by the cold, hard reality of their predicament. A new fire lit in Silas's ancient eyes, the fire of a long-overdue fight. "But he doesn't know about me," he said, a grim smile touching his lips for the first time. "No one remembers the boy who worked for Thomas. To them, I'm just a crazy old hermit. That's our advantage." He leaned forward, his voice a low, urgent command. "Here's what you're going to do. You're going to go back to that barn. Act normal. But be ready. Pack that chest. Everything. And have the children ready to move at a moment's notice. Don't let them see you're scared." He looked up at the sun, calculating the time. "They'll come after dark. They always prefer the dark. I'll be watching. My neighbor's dog, Old Blue, he barks at anything that moves on that back road. When you hear him start barking, don't wait, don't think. You grab your kids, you grab that chest, and you run. Head for the woods at the back of the property. I'll meet you there. We get you and that evidence out tonight." The plan was simple, desperate, and terrifying. Returning to the barn was one of the hardest things Helen had ever done. Every step back down the dusty road felt like a step toward her own execution. The barn no longer looked like a ruin. It looked like a mausoleum waiting for new occupants. The air inside was thick with the scent of their impending doom. She followed Silas's instructions, her movements numb and robotic. She gathered the few meager belongings they had, stuffing them into the single suitcase. She checked on the chest, making sure the journal and the deed were still safely inside, nestled beside the cold, heavy gold. She explained to Lucas and Sophie that they were going to play a game, a hiding game, and that when she gave the signal, they had to be very quiet and run with her. Lucas, with his father's solemn eyes, seemed to understand it was no game. He just nodded, his small face pale and set. Sophie, too young to grasp the danger, was just excited at the prospect of a secret adventure. The innocence of it was a knife in Helen's heart. As the sun began to set, the sky bleeding into shades of orange and blood red, the barn became a pressure cooker of tension. Helen sat on the floor, the heavy pry bar clutched in her hands, her back against the wall, facing the door. She tried to control her breathing, to listen past the frantic pounding of her own heart. The normal evening sounds began, the crickets starting their nightly chorus. But tonight, their song was not peaceful. It was a high-strung, nervous symphony. The last light faded from the sky, and the deep, rural darkness descended, a thick, suffocating blanket of black. Time seemed to slow down, each second stretching into a minute, each minute an hour. She strained her ears, listening for the sound Silas had told her to wait for, the barking of a dog. It was their only alarm, the only thing standing between them and whatever horror Caldwell was sending their way. Her entire world had shrunk to this one task, to listen, and to be ready to run for their lives. Then she heard it, faintly at first, carried on the night wind. A dog barking. It wasn't a playful yapping. It was a frantic, aggressive, panicked sound. All blue. He had seen something. A jolt of pure adrenaline shot through Helen, so powerful it made her gasp. "Now," she whispered, her voice tight and hoarse. "It's time. The game is starting." She grabbed the handle of the heavy wooden chest with one hand and Sophie's small hand with the other. "Lucas, hold on to my shirt. Don't let go, no matter what." Just as they were moving toward the back of the barn, a pair of headlights cut through the darkness, not from the main road, but bouncing and jostling as they came through the overgrown fields. A vehicle was driving directly towards the barn, avoiding the obvious approach. It stopped, and the engine was cut. A heavy silence descended again, more terrifying than the noise. Two car doors slammed shut, the sound echoing like gunshots in the night. They were here. The men outside were not trying to be quiet. Their heavy boots crunched loudly on the gravel and dry leaves as they approached the barn. Helen could hear their low, rough voices, though she couldn't make out the words. A sickening wave of fear washed over her. These were not men sent to negotiate. She half dragged, half carried the heavy chest, her muscles screaming in protest, her other hand a vice grip on Sophie's. Lucas scrambled behind her, his small hand bunched in the back of her cardigan. They reached the rear of the barn, where a large section of the wall had rotted away, creating a dark, jagged opening that led directly into the tangled woods. It was their only escape route. Just as they slipped through the gap, scratching their skin on splintered wood, a tremendous crash came from the front of the barn. It was the sound of the main doors being smashed open. A bright, powerful flashlight beam sliced through the dusty interior. "Check the whole place," a gruff voice yelled. "Find it." The escape through the woods was a blind, frantic nightmare. Thorny vines ripped at their clothes and skin, and unseen roots and rocks threatened to trip them at every step. Helen stumbled forward, her lungs burning, the weight of the chest pulling at her shoulder socket. Sophie was sobbing, her cries muffled against Helen's side. Lucas, though terrified, was silent, his focus entirely on keeping his grip on his mother's shirt. Behind them, they could hear the sounds of destruction. The thugs were tearing the barn apart, the crash of splintering wood and the shriek of tortured metal echoing through the trees. Flashlight beams cut wildly through the woods behind them, sweeping back and forth, searching. Helen's heart hammered in her chest. They were so close. The lights seemed to be getting nearer. She pushed herself harder, fueled by a primal terror, her only thought to put as much distance as possible between her children and the violence erupting behind them. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to keep moving deeper into the darkness. Her legs felt like lead, her breath coming in ragged, painful sobs. The chest felt like it was filled with stone, an anchor dragging her down. The flashlight beams were getting closer. The voices of the men louder, angrier. "They're not here. They must have run for the woods," one of them shouted. Panic, cold and absolute, threatened to overwhelm her. They were going to be caught. Right at that moment of despair, a new sound cut through the night, a low, sputtering rumble, the sound of an old, tired engine struggling to life. A single, dim headlight flickered on just ahead of them, a weak but steady beacon in the oppressive blackness. "Here!" a familiar, gravelly voice called out in a harsh whisper. "This way! Hurry!" It was Silas. He was there, just as he had promised. His ancient pickup truck idling at the edge of a barely visible track. Hope, fierce and desperate, surged through Helen, giving her one final burst of strength. She scrambled the last few feet, half falling, half throwing the chest and the children towards the open passenger door of the truck. Get in, Silas urged, his face a grim mask in the dim dashboard light. Lucas clambered in, pulling Sophie in after him. Helen heaved the heavy chest onto the floor of the cab and collapsed into the passenger seat, slamming the door shut. The shouts of the thugs were dangerously close now, their flashlight beams breaking through the trees right behind them. "Hold on!" Silas yelled. He slammed the truck into gear. The old vehicle groaned in protest, its tires spinning in the mud for a heart-stopping second before they found purchase. With a lurch that threw them all back against their seats, the truck shot forward, careening down the dark, overgrown path, away from the barn, away from the searching lights, and into the deep, uncertain sanctuary of the night. Silas gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white against the cracked bakelight. The old truck's engine was a low, complaining roar, a stark contrast to the thick, predatory silence of the woods they had just escaped. Helen sat numbly in the passenger seat, the children a warm sleeping pile between them. The adrenaline of the chase had drained away, leaving behind a hollow, vibrating exhaustion that made her bones ache. She could still hear the crash of the barn doors, the angry shouts of the men, a looping soundtrack of terror in her mind. The cab smelled of dust, old vinyl, and Silas's grim determination. He hadn't said much, only that he was using his life savings, every penny he had, to buy them this one chance. As they sped down the dark, empty highways, Helen watched the first distant orange glow of a city appear on the horizon. It wasn't a beacon of hope, not yet. It was just a different kind of darkness, one filled with concrete and strangers, and she clutched the heavy chest at her feet, as if it were the only real thing in the world. The rising sun glinted off the immense glass and steel facade of the UIS attorney's office, a towering monument to a kind of power Helen could barely comprehend. They looked like ghosts haunting its pristine plaza, a weary old man in faded overalls, a disheveled woman with scratches on her face and dirt under her fingernails, and two children still dazed with sleep and fear. The automatic glass doors hissed open, and they stepped from the city's grime into a world of polished marble and chillingly quiet authority. Their worn-out shoes made soft, apologetic sounds on the gleaming floor. Helen felt a fresh wave of panic, a suffocating feeling of being an imposter. What were they doing here? Who would listen to their insane story? She clutched her handbag, the journal indeed a lump against her side, her only credentials. Silas, however, walked with a slow, unwavering gait, his ancient eyes fixed forward. He had carried his secret for 50 years. He was not about to turn back at the door of judgment, a place he'd both feared and longed for his entire adult life. They were led into an office on the 12th floor. The air inside smelled of expensive leather, old books, and strong black coffee. Behind a vast mahogany desk sat a prosecutor, a woman in her 40s with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. She listened patiently, her face impassive, as Helen began to speak. Her voice, at first a trembling, hesitant whisper, slowly grew stronger as the torrent of injustice poured out of her. The eviction, the false hope of the barn, the discovery, the threat from Arthur Caldwell. Silas sat beside her, a silent, stoic statue, nodding at every point. Finally, with a hand that still shook, Helen retrieved the cloth-wrapped bundle. She placed the leather journal and the yellowed deed on the polished desk. The contrast was staggering. A fragile, crumbling piece of history, stained with dirt and time, lying on the sterile surface of modern justice. The prosecutor leaned forward, her professional mask finally showing a flicker of intense, personal curiosity. The weight of the past had just landed in the present. The prosecutor, a Ms. Anya Sharma, known for dismantling organized crime rings, picked up the journal with a careful, practiced hand. As she began to read, the sounds of the city outside the panoramic window seemed to fade away. The silence in the office became charged, electric. Helen watched her eyes move, her expression shifting from professional curiosity to sharp-edged focus, and finally, to a grim, steely resolve. Her gaze flickered from the frantic, final entry to Silas's deeply wrinkled face. "The oak tree," she said, her voice quiet but carrying immense weight. "You can show us where it is." Silas simply nodded, his eyes shimmering with tears. "I can take you right to it. I see it in my sleep." That was it. The connection was made. It was no longer just a story in a dead man's journal. It was a living testimony. Miss Sharma closed the book gently. She looked at Helen, and for the first time, Helen saw not a government official, but an ally. "Mr. Caldwell has made a grave mistake," the prosecutor said coldly. "The FBI will be very interested in this." The old oak tree stood as a silent, gnarled monument on the disputed property line, its massive branches reaching towards the sky like skeletal fingers. The area around it was no longer a quiet field. It was a meticulously organized crime scene. A fleet of black FBI vehicles was parked nearby, and the air, once filled with the scent of wildflowers, now smelled of diesel and disturbed earth. Forensic experts in white coveralls worked under the harsh glare of portable lights, their movements precise and economical. They used trowels and brushes, scraping away the layers of soil with an archaeologist's care. Helen and Silas watched from a distance, the quiet hum of the generator a backdrop to their anxious silence. Then, a cry went up from one of the agents. A hush fell over the entire team. They had found something, a piece of rotted canvas, and beneath it, the unmistakable shape of human bone. Silas let out a long, shuddering breath, a half-century of pent-up grief and guilt escaping his soul. The land had finally given up its dead. Arthur Caldwell was in a board meeting when they came for him. He was reviewing quarterly soybean futures, a king in his glass-walled castle, when the silent, tinted elevators opened and a team of FBI agents stepped out. There was no shouting, no violent confrontation like the one he had ordered at the barn. It was quiet, clinical, and brutally efficient. The agents walked past the stunned faces of his executive staff and into the boardroom. They presented the warrant, their voices calm and professional. The charge: accessory to the murder of Thomas, racketeering, and land fraud. The blood drained from Arthur's face, his carefully constructed mask of civility shattering into a rictus of pure shock and incandescent fury. As they snapped the cold steel handcuffs on his wrists in front of the empire he had inherited, he finally understood. The ghost he and his grandfather thought they had buried 50 years ago had risen from the earth, and it had come to collect its debt. The news cameras were already waiting for him in the lobby. The trial was a sensation, exposing the rot at the heart of the county's most powerful family. The journal, authenticated by experts, was read aloud in court, its words a damning indictment from beyond the grave. Silas, frail but resolute, took the stand, his eyewitness testimony the final, unassailable nail in the Caldwell dynasty's coffin. The forensic evidence from the grave of Thomas was irrefutable. Arthur Caldwell was convicted, his empire seized and dismantled by federal authorities. In a separate civil hearing, the court's decision was swift and absolute. The original deed from 1967 was upheld. Helen was declared the sole rightful heir to all 500 acres of her great-grandfather's stolen land. As the judge's gavel fell with a final, echoing crack, Helen felt a tremor pass through her. It was not the tremor of fear, but of an earthquake deep within her soul, as the tectonic plates of injustice, which had defined her family's past for half a century, finally shifted back into their rightful place. Justice had been done. Helen stood on a gentle rise, the deed to her 500 acres clutched in her hand. The wind whipped her hair across her face, but it was a clean wind, smelling of rich soil and open space, not of decay. The rotting barn had been carefully dismantled, its wood repurposed or respectfully burned. In its place, the sounds of creation now echoed across the valley, the rhythmic pop of nail guns, the whine of circular saws, the cheerful shouts of a construction crew. Using the first of the gold bars her great-grandfather had left as a war chest, she was not just building a house. She was resurrecting a dream, a beautiful, sturdy farmhouse in with a wide porch and large windows to let in the light was taking shape. This wasn't a desperate gamble for a roof. It was the deliberate, joyful construction of a home, a sanctuary built on a foundation not of fear, but of hard-won justice. With every timber raised, she felt the weight of the past lifting, replaced by the solid, comforting heft of a future she was building with her own hands. The evening sun slanted through the large kitchen window, casting a warm, dark golden glow on the room. The air was filled not with the stench of mold, but with the rich, comforting aroma of a beef stew simmering on a modern stove and the sweet scent of freshly baked bread cooling on a rack. At a large, sturdy oak table, Lucas and Sophie were laughing as they finished their homework, their faces bright and carefree. There was no battered suitcase held together with rope, only school bags filled with books and crayons. Helen leaned against the counter, a mug of tea warming her hands, and watched them. She was no longer a seamstress with no work, but the owner of a thriving organic farm, the Longhorn Creek homestead, she'd called it. The gnawing ache of hunger in her stomach had been replaced by a deep, profound sense of peace. Her heart, once a tight knot of fear, finally felt open and light. Her children were safe. They were home. And that was a treasure far greater than all the gold in the world. Standing on her wide porch that night, looking out at the vast, starry sky above her fields, Helen felt the presence of those she had lost, her husband, her great-grandfather, not as ghosts of tragedy, but as proud, silent guardians of the peace she had finally found. The flimsy eviction notice that had once defined her existence was now just a phantom memory, replaced by the solid reality of the earth beneath her feet and the undeniable proof that one person's courage can indeed change the world. The story of Helen's fortitude reminds us that even in the face of overwhelming power and soul-crushing despair, the truth, once planted, will eventually find its way to the light. If you were moved by her incredible journey from a desperate street corner to the master of her own destiny, make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications. That way, you won't miss another story of resilience, justice, and the ultimate triumph of the human spirit.